Good morning, everyone. This is a fly by the seat of my pants because last night I donated my laptop to British Airways, so we'll see how this goes. I reconstructed my PowerPoint first thing this morning. So, as Gabor said, we're looking at the transition, this important transition when we begin to get the first developed kingdoms in northwest Europe in this period. And my own area of study is really looking at northern Britain, where we probably find quite a different ways of expressing power and rulership in this period and in this region, where defended settlements, hill forts, promontory forts, seem to take on a more pronounced role than, say, the hall complexes that you find further south. In terms of the roles of these fortified settlements, we can certainly see that these are major centres of political struggle. So the few references that we do have for northern Britain in this period often mentions things like sieges and battles occurring at these defended sites. We can also see that they had other roles as well as places of inauguration, perhaps. So this is a footprint stone from Dinad in western Scotland, argued to be a place of inauguration of the early Dalriadic kings. We can also see shared hierarchies of power in these sites. So in the top left we have a site from Pitland, Mithertap, and on the bottom right we have Dinad, the royal settlement at Dinad, and you can see very similar hierarchies of settlement and architectural forms at these sites. But we generally have quite a poor understanding of how these develop through time. The previous strategies for looking at these, likes of work at Clattercraig in the centre there, you can see has been very much keyhole investigation of these complexes. So my own project at Aberdeen is looking at the development of Pictish society in northern Pitland. If we look at the historical sources, then we have a few things we can grapple with, but very limited, to be honest. So the Picts are first mentioned in late Roman sources, seemingly perhaps replacing a more dispersed form of political power. So Ptolemy's geography, for example, in the 2nd century, probably drawing on 1st century sources, mentions lots of different tribes in northern Britain in this time period. And it's in the late 3rd century that Picts are first mentioned, probably a nickname, the painted people. But you can see the Romans at times were quite concerned about Pictish society. So this is an amazing dice tower from the Roman frontier, which says the Picts are defeated, the enemy is destroyed, play in safety. And some of the narratives that have developed through this time period, going back to the 70s at least, have suggested that there was some form of political consolidation during the Roman period. So you can see, if we chart all the different tribal identities or late Iron Age identities, you can see that they are perhaps getting fewer through time through that Roman period. But others have suggested, simply the mention of the Picts is because the Romans don't really know what's going on beyond the northern frontier, and it doesn't tell us anything about political consolidation. So I guess our job is to see how the archaeology relates to that picture. In terms of once we get into the post-Roman period, we have some references to Pitland. There's very few native documents. There's a list of kings that go back into the Roman period, but it's really only from the mid-6th century onwards that we can say for sure that these are historical figures. There seems to be some concept of an over-kingship by the 7th century, and one of the most powerful kingdoms seems to have been this kingdom called Fortrue, which was always thought to be in central Scotland. But the historian Alex Wolff, I think, has very convincingly shown it's probably actually further north in the Moray Firth region. And the later sources emphasise royal centres in the south. So our project at Aberdeen, the Archaeology of Northern Picts, is looking at this northern area, which hasn't really been looked at in any concerted way. Is this a pointer, Gabby?
Yeah, yeah.
Is it this one? Oh, there we go. Working on Alex Wolff's movement of this kingdom for true into the north, our project is looking at this area in the Moray Firth region and also Aberdeenshire, an area that was probably known as Kay. In terms of the development of these fortified complexes, what we can say for sure is that there's no real relationship in terms of chronology between these defended sites and an Iron Age background. If we bring together all the radiocarbon dates for North East Scotland, for example, you can see there's a real break between the last centuries BC and the second generation of forts, I guess we could call it, in this largely post-Roman period in this area. What's also really quite amazing to think about is the scales of these sites. So on the left here we have quite a large, but not exceptionally large Iron Age site. This is the site at Rhynie that I'll talk quite a lot about today, and this is the Royal Centre, or so-called Royal Centre at Dunad. So you can see that. And if we look at the scales of rulership here, this is the complex at Rhynie, which I think goes in 17 times into the Iron Age fort, which gives you an idea of, there's something quite different going on here with these defended settlements. So Northern Picts is looking at a whole range of different sites, from settlement sites to silver hoards, but I'm just going to tell you about 3 different sites today: Rhynie, Dunacare and Baroque Head in this northeast part of Scotland. Whoa! The first site we investigated earlier last year, and it's this tiny little, what is now a sea stack, was probably a promontory in the early medieval period. It's a bit of a challenge to get there. It's now it's a tidal site. And the reason we went here is a number of reasons. Just in the next bay is this site at Dunnottar, which becomes one of the later major castles of Scotland. But one of the references in Annals of Ulster talks about the siege of Dunfother, which is thought to be located here. So clearly by the 7th century there was a major political centre at this site here. But there was perhaps an earlier site, and that was in the next bay. And the reason we suspected this is because 5 Pictish stones were found here in the 19th century. And you can see they're quite rough and ready compared to some of the stones I'll show you later on. The site was discovered in 1832 by a bunch of youths from the local village who got talking to the local gravedigger, who said that there was gold buried on top of the sea stack. They went up at great risk themselves and didn't find any gold, but they found these stones buried in a low stone wall, and being used to the day, they threw them into the sea. And it was only in the coming decades that people went back and recovered them. So we went back in spring 2015 to investigate the site, and this is what it looks like on top. You can see there's not an awful lot of it left, but clearly it was a much bigger promontory. We can tell that by the erosion around the edges. And what we found was essentially what those youths found in 1832. What we seem to have here is a promontory fort associated with these symbol stones, with evidence for a box rampart roundabout, with foundation slots for timber beams and stonework on stone facing on either side, and evidence for buildings inside. So this is a stone built hearth. You can see the charcoal that's been raked out of the hearth here on what I rather rashly called the lower terrace, which is now about 4 metres by 5 metres, literally on edge. And then on top there's clearly post hole buildings as well. What's particularly interesting about this site is that it dates to the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, which is really quite exceptional, as I'll talk about later. Almost all the sites from Pictland date to the 5th and 6th centuries AD onwards. So this seems to be a very early site, which is very interesting in terms of these symbol stones are always thought to be early examples. And it's exactly in that period, 3rd and 4th centuries AD, that the Romans first start mentioning the Picts, normally as sea raiders, which is quite interesting in terms of the location of this site. The second site I want to show you today is Rhynie. The reason we were interested in Rhynie is this place name, which derives from an early Celtic word, re for king, which is quite suggestive and a bit of a clue, although we didn't know that when we first started investigating the site. And we're also interested in this location because it's one of the most distinctive concentrations of these Class 1 Pictish symbol stones, which include this stone here, the crossstane, which probably stands its original position, which is quite unusual for these monuments. The most famous monument from this site is this guy here, the Rhynie man, who carries this double-handed axe, and he was found by the farmer in the 1970s, just downslope from the crossstane. And the final reason we were interested in this location was the fantastic crop marks that have been identified at the site since the 1970s, but previously uninvestigated. You can see that there's what turned out to be ditched enclosures and also a wooden wall or rampart around this little knoll on which the site stands. And what we've found... Sorry, can I take this down?
Yeah, just...
Is that better? I don't know if that's better. What we've found since 2011, 2012 in particular, is that the crossstane stands at the entranceway into a defended complex, including ditches here, and then an outer wooden plank-built, oak plank-built structure on the outside with post holes on the inside of that. And you can also see there's post and plank buildings inside the enclosures. And as I say, this is the fine spot of the Rhynie man, and he was found in the area that is we now know is the entranceway into this defended complex. The status of the site is underlined by the finds. We're getting lots of sherds of beeware or late Roman amphora coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, and this is the distribution of this material. You can see how exceptional Rhynie is, not least because it's 40 kilometres inland compared to the other sites across here. Drinking vessels from France, exactly the kind of stuff you would be drinking your fine wine, Mediterranean wine out of in the 6th century. What we're also getting is evidence for production and consumption, moulds for making brooches and pins, nice bronze pins as well. Scotland's only known early medieval metalworking tongs, very fine metalworking tongs, about this size. And this amazing artifact here, the iron pin, which is where the logo comes from for the network, which you can see a little serpent biting onto the end of an axe. Exactly the kind of axe that the Rhynie man is carrying, which is quite amazing. We were back this year, 2015, to investigate a little bit more, and we were targeting the area in which the Rhynie man was found. This is our excavations here. And in terms of long-term chronologies, something I want to talk about today, this is Tapa North, which is one of the most significant Iron Age forts known in northeast Scotland. A huge complex of monuments up here, and exactly the kind of fort that also gets reused in the early medieval period. So here you can see the outer wooden wall enclosing the little knoll in which it's situated, and this is the entranceway coming from the river down here, with a possible early church site down here. And probably the most significant feature we found this year was a stone socket in the area where the Rhynie man was found. And at the base of the stone socket was a cattle jaw that had been placed at the bottom of the standing stone socket. So that's quite exciting. And once again, it's in the entranceway into the complex here. So you can see the post holes, the outer plank-built wall here, and all sorts of entrance features around this complex here. And slowly over the last few years we've began to piece together the ground plan of the structure of the entranceway here. Some are very elaborate timber, plank and post built structure next to the two standing stones, post and plank structures inside, and this is something we want to investigate a bit more this coming year. What's also pretty clear, I think, from the iconography of the site is that this is not just a secular centre of power. We can see that clearly this had cult dimensions, and it was very interesting to hear Gabor talk about horse sacrifice. Cattle seems to be the big thing in Pictland. Our cattle bone assemblage from Rhynie is almost entirely cattle with some pig, and likewise other sites seem to be similar. And this type of axe that these characters carry has been interpreted as an axe relating to cattle's sacrifice. And it seems to be related to late Roman examples, which were called dolabra, which were used by priests for sacrificing cattle. And I think, the cult dimensions of some of these other figures, this is Papel in Shetland, for example, and a site called Koningsborough in Shetland, which in Old Norse means the king's fort, rather revealingly. You can see that we've got similar characters here, almost shamanic type figures, half animal, half human, with these incredible legs. The dating from Rhynie is pretty convincing. 450 to 550 AD is the general spread of dates. I think we've got about 20 dates there. We've got another 15 coming, and every date so far broadly falls within that 450 to 550, and the artefacts would agree with that, the beware, etc. What we've also shown in the last few years is that we don't just have a single site at Rhynie. We've clearly got a landscape, a polyfocal landscape of power here. So we've got a large cemetery that extends down towards the village. So the Crossdane complex is here. Down by the village we have square barrows with inhumation graves that date to 450 to 550 AD. And some of the other symbol stones came from this area, including a warrior figure carved in this location. We've been doing more geophysics in the wider landscape, and my project manager is actually out there today looking at areas detected in recent geophysics which appear to be metal scatters, or we're finding lots of metalworking slag down here next to which was what was a large bog until the 18th or 19th centuries. So it looks like, again, like La Minge, we might have major evidence for metalworking in this area as well. Right, final site to show today. This is Baroque Head, which is up in the Murray coast. It's like many sites in northern Pictland, it's undocumented, but it's the largest Pictish fort known. In fact, it's the largest early medieval fortified site known in the whole of northern Britain, about 3 times the size of others. It was a promontory fort like Dunnacair, but on an entirely different scale. Unfortunately, it was largely trashed in the 19th century by the construction of the planned village of Baroque Head. But during that construction, they found lots of carvings of bulls, which, if we're talking about animal sacrifice, is quite interesting. So there may have been as many as 30 of these carvings of bulls from Baroque Head. There's only 6 surviving today. What's clear though is that Baroque Head has a longer lifespan than sites like Rhynie, and it seems to go on at least till the 10th century AD. And what we also have from Baroque Head is fragments of early Christian sculpture, including parts of shrines, parts of cross slabs, and also depictions of mounted warriors, which becomes a real obsession of Pictish sculpture, probably from the 7th century AD onwards. Baroque Head was largely assumed to have been completely trashed in the 19th century, and there's actually been very little work in the interior of the fort. There's been some work dating the ramparts very poorly, I might add. So we went in earlier last year to just do some trial excavations here to see what the survival was like actually inside the fort. And we found big midden layers of 19th century rubbish, but we also found intact early medieval deposits underneath that. So in the larger trench here, which is only 4 metres by 2 metres, we found what looks like a destroyed building with floor levels, post holes, quern stones, an iron buckle, And next to it, we found a very deep animal bone midden, absolutely jam-packed full of cattle bone, which is, again, quite revealing. And in that animal bone midden, we found a fragment of a 9th century Anglo-Saxon coin. Here you can see it's been pierced for wearing. You know, what do you do in Pictland? In a non-monetary economy, you wear your coins. And also some sort of belt buckle as well here. The radiocarbon dates, we sampled ground surface underneath the rampart that had been exposed by erosion, which dates to the 4th century, so the fort must date 5th century or later, which doesn't sound like, you know, the greatest result, but our dating for the site is so poor that it gives us a real strong baseline to work with. The posthole from the building dates to the 6th century, and the midden is really quite late, 9th or even 10th century AD. So again, it shows that long lifespan of this site. And then when we put all these radiocarbon dates together that we've got from the project and also from previous excavations, this is what we get after throwing out all the 1970s dates that have, you know, spans of about 4 or 5 centuries. This is what we get. You can see that Dunacair is right at the start of that sequence in that 3rd and 4th centuries context, whereas you can see just about all the other sites date to that 5th and 6th centuries AD period. And this seems to be quite a watershed transformation in that 5th century AD, in that immediate post-Roman context. Within a few generations, people are beginning to construct these fortified settlements in quite a widespread fashion. And it's really that 5th and 6th centuries AD context that seem to be really important in the terms of the development of these fortified sites. And likewise, these symbol stones, which also seem to be major symbols of power for this time period, it looks like perhaps Dunacair, some early examples in that late Roman period, but again, largely a post-Roman phenomena. So what we can see really is that what we seem to get is that we do indeed seem to have archaeological change in that late Roman context, which may well be associated with the emergence of that Pictish identity in that late Roman context. But we can see that to date it's quite geographically restricted. We have this one coastal promontory fort. And as I say, it's quite interesting in terms of the Romans talking about the Picts as being sea raiders in that late Roman context. But really it's the 5th and 6th century when that bonds of clientship which allow forts to be constructed through labour given by clients that really allow that consolidation perhaps of power at these fortified complexes in that 5th and 6th century AD context. And what we can see at sites like Rhynie is that these new forms of power seem to be very much underpinned by the divine, by the sacred. So depictions of Rhynie style figures carrying axes involved in animal sacrifice very much seem to be a major part of the development of these sites in that 5th and 6th century context. And what we seem to have through time is a consolidation of power in fewer and fewer centres. It's only certain sites like Baroque Head that seem to go on into the 7th century onwards. And we actually have very few sites dated from the 7th century onwards, but they are very impressive sites like Baroque Head. And what we see at Baroque Head is an increasing alignment with Christian ideas of kingship, with a probable early church actually within the bounds of the fort, and Christian sculpture and depictions of the warrior king, these mounted warriors occurring from that 7th century AD onwards. So that seems to be the broad scale site dynamics and long-term chronologies that we've established in Pictland to date. Okay, thanks for listening.